Hello, I'm Dawn Durham.
And I'm Dr. Erica Karuder.
Welcome to PaTTANpod. A multi-tiered system of support, MTSS, should integrate components of academics and behavior, keeping in mind the social-emotional learning that comes along with both sides of that MTSS triangle. When we think about that triangle, there are many facets to understand, enhance, and refine. Dr. Kent McIntosh is joining us on PaTTANpod to discuss the sustainability of an equitable multi-tiered system of support. Dr. McIntosh, thank you so much for joining us on PaTTANpod today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. Well, we're going to jump right in. And I know that Erica's really excited as a fellow school psychologist of yours.
Welcome, Dr. McIntosh. Again, thank you for being here. As you're aware, this week is School Psychology Awareness Week, and this year's theme is Find Your Focus. Can you tell us a little bit about the focus that you found in your role in school psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've moved out of the practice and into the research world, I've got a few areas that I still connect to practice in what I do. And the two main areas of the work that I've been focusing on most intensively have been, one is a field called implementation science. And that's the study of how new practices, systems, interventions are adopted, implemented, and sustained. And then another area is educational equity and ensuring that the systems that we put into place work not just for most students, but for each student in schools. And so those are two that keep me really connected to the work out in the field. It's something that people are really interested in for a really good reason. And it is all about people on the ground doing the work.
Yes, thank you, Dr. McIntosh. And both of those, implementation science as well as equity, are important concepts to us here at PaTTAN as well. So thank you for sharing that.
I want to kind of piggyback off what you had said. You said you're interested in implementation science, which kind of leads me to this question. When we think about our school teams that want to implement both sides of that MTSS triangle, academics and behavior, and they want to implement with fidelity, as we would want for any kind of implementation. Thinking about that implementation science, what are some of the most important areas that teams need to be thinking about to do that successfully?
Well, I think the most important thing, and this is going to sound very, very basic, but the idea of actually measuring fidelity of implementation is absolutely key. If you want to do it well, you got to know how well you're doing and what are the next steps for improvement. And there are a number of tools that people can use on each side of the triangle. So people are familiar with the tools that come from the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, like the Tiered Fidelity Inventory or the Benchmarks of Quality. On the academic side, it's a little bit more varied what's used, but it's still as important to be able to assess the fidelity of implementation of systems. And you know what I often say when people ask, if we're doing integrated work and we know the importance of looking at academic skills and behavior support at the same time, shouldn't we use like one tool that does both of those? And we're really not there in terms of having really good measures to do that. And so my best recommendation for those who want to focus on fidelity on both sides is to look at each side's fidelity and assess those separately, but start to think about how can we integrate the teams. And sometimes it's very easy to say we should integrate all of our work all the time and every triangle should be absolutely seamless and you can't tell the difference between academic support and behavior support. And that is a wonderful thing, but that's really kind of a 10-year vision of what to do. And sometimes we start thinking about what's the first step that people can take to do this work really well. And a lot of times it's just having the teams, picking the teams well so that there's overlap across the teams. If one team can do it, that's great. But a lot of times people use separate teams for tier 1 work, but then start to integrate at tiers 2 and 3 And that's when we start looking, at individual students. And it's just so important when we do that to have both kinds of data at the table for our decision making. So we want to be able to see the academic skills and where the areas of growth. And we also want to see the behavior support needs and behavior strengths of the context too. And so, I think you're hearing from me, the big point of it is using those data, whether they're fidelity data or student outcomes data, to really help improve the systems that we put into place.
So when we think about, and I'm glad you said this, we do want the integration of academics and behavior and the socio-emotional piece. We all agree on that. But, and I'm glad that you pointed out, that's a long-term vision.
Yes.
And we need to accept that long-term vision so we don't become flustered and overwhelmed and the system just crashes before it ever really had a chance to succeed. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. Thank you. And I think our viewers will appreciate hearing that honest opinion that it's a long-term goal. And that piece of understanding the data of fidelity, of implementation, the student data, the outcomes on a variety of measures, I think are all important aspects to mention. So I appreciate you thinking that through with us and really highlighting those features for our teams. You had talked about that you're really into educational equity, and we know that equity plays a large part in a multi-tiered system of support. Equity plays a large part in everything we do or should play a large part. How do you define equity in schools? What does that mean for you?
It's really important for us to have clear ideas of what these really big terms that people are using are. And I actually just default to a definition. It's a really complex thing. And I default to the Great Lakes Equity Center and the work that they do. And they have this 4-part definition of what equity in education is. And the first part is access. So ensuring that each student has access to evidence-based practices in schools, access to high quality instruction, high quality teachers, the school facilities that the structures are not crumbling, that are safe for students to be in, both physically, but then also emotionally as well. And then the second area is representation, that our students can see themselves in the schools and the systems that we put into place. Then the third one is meaningful participation. So we're including students when we're talking about at the school level. When at the district level, we're talking about school students and staff participating and being ensured that they can play a role in building what systems are being applied to them. And then that fourth one is high outcomes for all learners, that we are really focused on the goal of improving outcomes for students from each background that we see out there, that our systems are effective for every student, not just most students.
So you're right, equity it's a big term. It's a complex term, and we do seem to throw it around a lot, but I kind of gave us this 4-part definition of access, representation, meaningful participation, and high outcomes for all students. I think those are 4 pillars that really do define equity and what we're looking for all of our students across the educational system. So I appreciate that. I appreciate your insight on that.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you. And thinking about, talking about the systems level work and thinking about equity, that is an important component to embed throughout all multi-tiered systems, whether academic or behavioral. And so as we talked about, it is a multi-year process, a long time teams need to commit to. So another important thing that we want to hear from you about, Dr. McIntosh, is what does it take to create a sustainable multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS framework?
Great question. And it's often something that people are wondering about, but they might also be a little fearful of. And sometimes when we start thinking about sustainability, we get really nervous and try to change the subject to something else, just because some of the systems work that we do is really, really fragile. And we've spent the last almost 10 years looking at this idea of sustained implementation and what does it take to do. with a focus on trying to identify what are the most important actions that a school team can take, that a school administrator can take, that district teams and state teams can take to ensure sustainability. Because there's lots of really important good things to do, but what are the things that are just absolutely the most important ones? And so our research over this time has identified a few of those. As I was describing from your second question, use of data. So that would be not just use of, but collection, use for decision making, and then also sharing out with staff, sharing out with students, sharing out with stakeholders is absolutely important. It gives us a marker for how we're doing. It gives us an idea for next steps. It gives us a chance to step back and objectively see how well we're doing, particularly with different student groups and so on. Another area is teaming, the extent to which school staff and administrators can work together efficiently to improve outcomes. And a lot of times people think, everybody's attended many meetings. And unfortunately, a lot of us attend meetings that are just not run as well as they could be. And that's just a little bit of a lack of attention to some of the really basic fundamentals. So some of the things that we recommend are, having a really clear defined agenda, using electronic minutes that are projected so that everybody can see them right there and we don't have to wait for somebody to type up the minutes or so on. And then really clear ways to get the data that we need for the decision making. And one example of that is called TIPS, or the Team-Initiated Problem-Solving Process. And that is one example of a collection of teaming work that can be done. And that can be done across behavior, across academics, social emotional learning, all of those, any of those good meeting habits and good meeting activities can fit for really any meeting purpose you'd like. And then another thing that we found, particularly at the school level, is implementation of classroom systems and classroom PBIS systems. And so we found that it's fairly easy to get PBIS up around the school, in the hallways, in the front area, in the cafeteria, the bus loading zone, and so on. But a lot of times school teams, and this is part because this is the way that we taught it, 15, 20 years ago, will sort of stop before they get to classroom implementation, because everyone's just a little bit worried about this idea of trying to tell somebody else how to run their classroom. And what we find is that more often than not, we're all a little bit nervous about opening up our classrooms for other people, but we also know that this perception that every teacher has to be a superhero who knows everything about classroom management for every student, or everything we know about high quality academic instruction for every student, that's a really dangerous assumption that we make. And I think it cuts us off from collaboration. So being able to think not just about how we're implementing at the school, but how we're implementing in the classroom is really key. And we see schools, from a PBIS side at least, schools that have greater classroom PBIS implementation are more likely to sustain, they're more likely to have improved outcomes, and they're more likely to have equitable outcomes for students. So classroom implementation is really, really key. And then the other parts that we're just getting a little bit closer to understanding now are, what are the district and the state systems that are needed to support the schools in doing their work. And we know, just as it's important for schools to have a team that functions well, it's absolutely critical for districts and states to have teams that work well and actually use implementation capacity measures, just like the fidelity measures at their schools, to see how well they're doing, what are the parts that are working nicely, and then what are some next steps to do.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm hearing for the big ideas of sustainability are that, number one, data are important, and not just for that team to look at, but to share those data with all stakeholders. Teaming is especially important. We need those people to keep the work moving forward. Structured meeting agendas and meeting norms so that we are efficient and effective in our meetings and using data to drive our decision making. TIPS is one that you mentioned. That's something we use widely in Pennsylvania. And the other piece is really getting that systems level practice of PBIS or MTSS at the classroom level and partnering with those teachers so that they are able to, continually be improving their classroom practices. And it's important then to look forward as how can districts as well as state systems, how can those regional partners help support schools in implementation and sustaining their efforts?
Absolutely. That's a great summary.
I want to just pause for a minute and think, we really do want folks to be inspired educationally. We want them to think about where they need to go. And having you on is such a benefit for all of us who view the PaTTAnpod episodes, because you certainly have a lot to share with us about your knowledge and your insight and your own practice and experiences. If I may, what kind of advice might you offer to the field to really inspire them to grow educationally? What would you say to them?
I think the most important thing is that you got to find what drives you. So what are the things that spark passion in the work that's done? Because we all need to have ways to get rejuvenated and refreshed as professionals. And sometimes whether that's because we're tired and there's more stuff to do and the systems change work is really hard when we're so busy putting out fires. But we also might need to find what sustains us when we're experiencing trauma or vicarious trauma from our students as well. And I'll tell you, at least from my perspective, I think a lot about the power of positivity. And sometimes people use that as a really kind of generic, broad thing that's a little loosey-goosey. But I actually really think about it in very specific actions and activities. So I think about it in kind of three ways. Number one, obviously, is positive feedback. We all do better when we get positive feedback, and we feel more effective as teachers and supervisors and family members when we're providing positive feedback about what we want to see, as opposed to just noticing and correcting what we don't want to see. Then the second one is modeling positive behavior. And so what that means is not holding grudges. It means if I want to be treated in a particular way, I really need to take that next step to model that. And that's really important when we're working with either adults who are under stress or students who are still have developing brains, that it's really key that we catch ourselves before kind of doing well, if they did that to me, I'm going to do that back to them, and really kind of give up on that and say, I am the role model for the people around me right now. And then the third one is this idea of assuming positive intent. That my very first assumption when I walk into, as I was describing, when I walk into those meetings, or when I'm working with a family, or when I'm working with students, or when I'm working with my students' teachers, for example, I always want to assume that they're doing their very best with the skills that they have then, and that their intent is to improve outcomes for students and the people around them. And when I walk in that way, it's much easier for me to work constructively as opposed to falling into other people's ruts of negative interactions.
I think those are good points to make.
Those three ideas of positivity, I think, match really nicely for, they work, and I feel better afterwards too.
Well, that's always helpful. So that positive feedback, the modeling positive behavior, and that assuming that we all are here with a positive intent. But then also, being reflective and asking what drives me. What's going to continue to drive me to do the job that I'm in? So I appreciate that advice, and I know all those in the field do as well. We're so glad that you're able to come speak with us on PaTTAnpod today, Dr. McIntosh. It's been a joy, and we look forward to future endeavors with you.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure, and I've always enjoyed coming out to Pennsylvania and working with your schools and staff.
Well, we're hoping you'll visit us again soon. Thank you so much.
Sounds great.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTANpod.